In regard to all this bad news, and those who would run for cover and say it's all nonsense, I don't want to hear, as they're covering their eyes and their ears and pretending it'll all go away. Stockholm Syndrome. Many don't know what Stockholm Syndrome is, and pseudo-patriotism, because these two go together. There's an excellent report here. I want to read through it quickly because I have a lot of ground to cover still, and it gives the listener an idea on what Stockholm Syndrome is and how it applies to populations, especially the U.S. population in many regards. A government has the power. This is by a report by Harriet Elliott, by the way. My thanks to him. It's an excellent report. A government has the power in most cases to enslave us at a moment's notice for a war we may not support, and to silence anyone who speaks ill of its military plans. It forces us to send our children to school, whether or not we approve of it. It forbids us from agreeing freely with an employer to work for less than a minimum wage. It tells us what we may and what we may not buy, sell, eat, drink, watch, smoke, drive, and consent to. Most concerning, it demands up to 40% of the money we make to fuel these acts of coercion, and has the power to incarcerate and fine us if we refuse to pay up. One would perhaps expect, given we have come to value freedom and individuality, liberty, over the last century or so, that people would loathe the state. Yet, to the contrary, any effort to shrink its size or scope is met with indignation. It's hardly surprising that within the structure of the state, individuals seek to maximize their own political and economic interests. A lot of selfishness. That's how we got in this dark corner again. The report continues. Unfortunate though the results may be for the bankers and energy companies of this world, it is curious, however, that people not only support the process of the state, but also the entity of it. There appears to be something deeply embedded in the psyche that many would label, quote, patriotism. However, it is difficult to tell why somebody would feel patriotic to a state which has, does, and will deny its citizens vast swaths of rights, which persistently evades transparency measures, and which bullies people into paying for its services. Patriotism becomes even harder to explain when we consider just how arbitrary nationality is. We have no choice as to when or where we were born, so it seems odd that we should exhibit specific loyalty to the particular government within those borders we came to be in, especially when this loyalty also compromises actively fighting people from other nations. There is one particular psychological condition, however, which sheds some light on this quandary. It is named after a 1973 incident in which 4 hostages repeatedly sympathized with and sought to protect 2 bank robbers who had held them for nearly a week. In the last 40 years, a handful of more examples of the Stockholm Syndrome, that's what we're talking about here, Stockholm Syndrome, have occurred, each involving victims showing compassion to criminals, often in improbable and shocking circumstances. Psychological precedent would suggest that 4 conditions are required for Stockholm Syndrome to develop. First, the criminal must pose a serious threat to the victim. Second, the victim must be isolated from outside influences. Third, the victim must feel completely unable to escape his captivity or to defend himself. Fourth, the victim must feel that some compassion has been shown. This does not entail a bank robber offering burgers and cookies to a hostage, but simply means that the captors have not been as aggressive as they theoretically could have been. While Stockholm Syndrome is hard to pin down, owing to the panic of most situations in which it occurs and the rarity and range of its appearances, these 4 conditions remain fairly stable. The first 3 are necessary to trigger the primal response. Again, that's important to consider. It's a primal defense mechanism, Stockholm Syndrome, to which the phenomenon has been attributed. Victims must be powerless, at the mercy of an all-powerful assailant, and far away from others who can help. The 4th condition causes humans instinctively to believe that the otherwise bizarre behavior of capitulation, respect, and sympathy is the utility-maximizing action to follow. Stockholm Syndrome seems to be a long-forgotten evolutionary response to large-scale, overpowering threats. Think about that. Stockholm Syndrome seems to be a long-forgotten evolutionary response to large-scale overpowering threats, a primitive defense mechanism. This is epidemic in our society. The denial of what's happening around us, no matter how obvious it is, no matter how threatening, no matter how dark the horizon, we have this primitive defense mechanism going off in people. Continuing, let us therefore try to link the four defining traits of Stockholm Syndrome to the situation of a citizen within a modern state. First, we must establish that the aggressor poses a threat to its victims. This is, in fact, precisely how the government functions. Every violation of the law is met with a series of powerful responses, up to and including life imprisonment. Indeed, if no overwhelming threat existed to citizens, they would have no incentive to obey laws. Second, we must show that the victims are disconnected from the outside world. In the context of government coercion, outside influences most accurately means people from other countries. However, it then becomes obvious why these outside influences fail to hold back Stockholm Syndrome. They are all also under the power of an oppressive state. This is uniformly true around the globe. Given that hostages exhibit Stockholm Syndrome, even alongside other hostages, it follows that this sort of external contact has no impact on the condition. Third, we have to show that citizens are unable to escape their captivity or to defend themselves against the force of the state. While constitutionalists like to protect the Second Amendment rights for fear of totalitarianism, it is reasonably self-evident that no individual has any hope of defending himself from a modern government. No denying that fact. This is arguably most true in the US, whose military spends more than every single other military in the world combined. I think it's the top 10 militaries is what they're referring to here, but imagine that. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined. Escaping to another country means nothing when the country is also an oppressor. And in regard to those that would defend the Second Amendment, I want to weave this into the Hammond event that just happened. I know some people were killed, and I hope if such a protest occurs again in the future, I think it's tragic that there were mortalities in that event, but I hope people who protest leave your guns at home. Do not bring your guns. That is exactly what those in power want you to do. Don't buy into that. Leave your weapons at home. They have no place in such a protest as that. And I hope we can avoid such an outcome in the future. And it would have gone much better had weapons not been brought to that protest. I want to continue with this report on Stockholm Syndrome and the epidemic it is with American populations and populations around the globe. Having plausibly satisfied these three burdens, our only task remaining is to show that the government exhibits some compassion towards citizens. Luckily, this is not difficult. The state furnishes children with free education, the unemployment with welfare, pensioners, guaranteed Social Security, everyone with roads, hospitals, other public services paid for in a significant part by a small portion of the population. Even if thousands of social services the government provides do not seem sufficiently charitable, we can look to political theorists who suggest that our present government is permissible because past states abused their power even more. So we accept the lesser of the evils, at least in the public mind. While saying that slavery's abolition magically makes income taxes legitimate is akin to arguing that carpet bombing London is acceptable because we could have launched a nuclear missile instead. This sort of discourse directly affirms that states could theoretically be less compassionate than they are at present and yet continue to function. In other words, with Stockholm Syndrome, if the victim perceives that they could be abused even more, this is the fourth trigger point for Stockholm Syndrome. And many people we know live in fear right now, don't they? How many people have I heard from that say, I would speak out about climate engineering and other issues, but I'm afraid. I'm simply afraid. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? If the ship is going down and you're on the ship, why wouldn't you make your voice heard? while you can? Why wouldn't you try to help plug the leak and change the course of the ship while you still have a chance to do something? Final paragraphs of this report. The above suggests that Stockholm Syndrome may well exist in citizens towards their states. As a result, it is unsurprising to see the symptoms of such a condition in a society. People often ignore or actively deny how oppressive their government is, and disregard or rapidly override the harms of coercion when discussing the legitimacy of a particular policy or patriotism, or whichever term you would prefer, since the word has other meanings tied up with it, is a rational response to an all-powerful subjugator, and once entrenched becomes hard to shed. Once these ideologies are adopted, once Stockholm Syndrome is ingrained, it's very difficult to break that paradigm, to break that programming, if you will. This all-powerful government father figure that people want to blindly go along with, if you will, no matter how tyrannical it becomes. Is this what built this country? This is the paradox. I hear people that claim to stand for the Constitution and that they want to stand on the principles that built this country, yet they don't behave in a manner that seems to back up what they're saying. They don't. They're not even willing to show up and peacefully, I use that word strongly, peacefully protest the fact that we're all being sprayed like rats from the sky. And there's no denying this. There's no denying. We have film footage of a crime happening. How do you deny it? We have undeniable film footage of these tankers spraying at altitude. We have lab tests to prove that this material is showing up in our air, water, soils. How can people pretend that's not going on? How can people pretend that what happened in Vietnam was right? We know now it was a false flag event. How can people ignore the 9/11 issue when you have 2,500 architects and engineers from around the world saying the official story is absolute nonsense? Again, I'll use Building 7 for an example. Who could rationally believe that a 47-structure steel high-rise building could collapse in 7 seconds, free fall speed, because of some furniture burning in the first floor? If you believe that, you need to seriously recheck your reality, because you have a very serious case of Stockholm Syndrome, that you are willing to blindly defend those that are actually tyrannically running the country of which you are a part of. The fact that this report finishes with this, the fact that the government seems to be an institution for good, not evil, is what makes this thesis so hard to believe. Yet, of course, that is precisely the point. Unnatural feelings of support for those within arbitrary borders and dislike for those without. Tribalism, I mentioned it earlier, this is tribalism. It's part of what's destroying the planet. Can only be explained as the product of a deep psychological phenomenon. Breaking free may be hard, even counterintuitive, but unless we do so, we risk being forever engulfed in blind obedience to a state that should command neither our will nor our support without first justifying its existence. This is the silent epidemic that has brought such darkness and destruction on the planet and all life. This tribalism that's rampant even today, that we can see hundreds of thousands of people showing up for a Super Bowl celebration game. And yet, who do we see protesting the atrocities that are happening around the globe right now? Where's any mention of that? To watch mainstream media and know what's really happening in the world is appalling. It stirs a sense of righteous anger inside that forces one to speak out. To speak out. It's our responsibility. It's not an option. It's an obligation. You can't look at your children and tell them you love them and ignore what's happening in the world that will soon cost them their future. Period.